prevent violence in some of the most hotly contested areas of that country. But that cessation of hostilities was short-lived. After several weeks, it began to fray, and it's only worsened over that period of time. But we should just be clear about why that happened. That happened because the Assad regime didn't live up to the commitments that they made in the context of that cessation of hostilities. They continued to provoke and attack opposition forces, and in some cases, innocent civilians. And that wasn't some kind of secret strategy that was employed by the Assad regime. They were pretty bold about announcing that they were going to go and bomb hospitals, targeting civilians, until they could get some of these groups to surrender. Setting the immorality of that approach aside, it's an indication that the Russians were either unable or unwilling to use their influence with the Assad regime to get them to live up to the cessation of hostilities. For reasons that I guess you'd have to ask the Russians, they now are making a renewed commitment to doing so. I suspect that part of it stems from their concern about getting sucked into this conflict over the long term, something that the United States warned of since we saw this military intervention by Russia last year. I suspect that some of this stems from ramped up concerns about extremist activity in Syria on the part of Al-Qaeda in Syria. I think some of it stems from a Russian desire to enhance their international reputation by being able to say that they're working with the Americans. So the dynamics in this relationship, I think, are quite clear. But being able to move forward here is entirely contingent on Russian credibility. And we'll need to see them deliver before they get the kind of cooperation that they'd like to see.
Thank you, Josh.
Pam.
Josh, the president has suggested that there could be new sanctions on North Korea following their latest nuclear test. What new sanctions could be possible, and would they have any impact given that North Korea has continued to test nuclear tests and ballistic missile tests and seems to be now scoffing at the idea of more sanctions?
Well, this is actually something, Pam, that the United Nations Security Council is considering even as we speak. I know that there's a statement from the Security Council over the weekend that indicated that they were going to consider additional economic sanctions that could be imposed against North Korea for their continued and flagrant violations of a variety of Security Council resolutions. For a statement like that to come forward, it has to have the unanimous agreement of the Security Council. And I think that's an indication of how unified the international community is in prioritizing the situation in North Korea, in being alarmed about the situation in North Korea, and in considering additional steps to isolate the North Korean government even further. So there's some important work to be done at the United Nations, and the United States will be supportive of that process. The other thing I'd point out is that on Thursday, the president did a news conference in Laos prior to this most recent nuclear test in North Korea. And the president talked about how, while we have been pleased with the constructive contribution that the Chinese have made to applying pressure on the North Koreans, the president believes there's more that they could do. And there have been a number of conversations, including between President Obama and President Xi, about the need to continue to make dealing with this situation a priority.
So there are no separate U.S. sanctions that might be considered?
Well, I certainly wouldn't rule out an announcement like that, but those kinds of sanctions are not the kind of sanctions that we talk about publicly, because doing so would only tip our hand and allow those who are the target of the sanctions to make arrangements to try to avoid them before we're even able to implement them in the first place. So, if there are more sanctions like that are put forward, then we'll certainly announce them publicly and explain to you the rationale for why they were imposed. But we won't do that until a final policy decision has been made about them.
And just one more, what is the level of concern about North Korea developing ballistic missiles that could have a nuclear weapon on it reaching the United States?
You've heard experts in the U.S. government indicate their continuing concern with the way that North Korea's missile program and their nuclear program has advanced. In part, that is why the United States has taken steps at the direction of the Commander-in-Chief to enhance our anti-ballistic missile capabilities in the Asia-Pacific. The United States has deployed additional naval assets in the Pacific, including Aegis systems that can be used to defend the United States against ballistic missiles. There's technology that's been deployed to Japan to better track those missiles and enhance our ability to defend the United States and our allies against them. There's a THAAD battery that's been deployed to Guam. And as you know, the United States and South Korea recently agreed to deploy an additional THAAD battery in South Korea, all of which is oriented against the threat from North Korea. And I think it's an indication that President Obama takes the threat seriously and is committed to taking the prudent steps that are required to protect the American people and our allies. Okay. Sarah.
Thanks, Josh. Shortly before the briefing, the White House made the decision to let the pool have access to the president's meeting with Congress today. Can you give us a little insight into the thinking behind that?
Well, I think primarily the idea was, the president was interested in having a meeting with the congressional leaders, and there was a discussion about the most effective way to convey to all of you exactly what had happened in the context of that meeting. And so, the original plan had been to do a written readout, and we decided to let at least a small subset of you hear directly from the president himself about the discussion that he had with the congressional leaders.
And so, Tolu was very earnest today, but not to channel cynical Tolu.
I always appreciate that.
Did it, it didn't have anything to do with the likelihood of questions about protected pools and transparency and that sort of thing?
No, it did not.
And, one more on these lines. You wrote an op-ed to the New York Times, a letter to the editor not too long ago, where you said President Obama's government transparency effort is not even noted by the Times media columnists, and why would future presidential candidates make it a priority? Is there any evidence that transparency has practical or political benefits beyond getting cheers from the press corps?
Yeah, I think that's the point of the letter that I tried to write. At a different point, I made clear that the only real constituency for transparency in government is all of you. And good thing. That's an important role that all of you play in our democracy. American voters, I think largely, almost all of them, are considering a range of other factors when they walk into the ballot, when they walk into the voting booth. So that's why it's important for all of you to play the role that you do. And it is why our approach to transparency is one in which we would never expect for anybody who's sitting in those chairs to say that we've done enough. It's your responsibility to constantly push for more. And all of you have lived up faithfully to that responsibility. So thank you. The point of the letter, though, was that I expressed my opinion that kind of advocacy is more effective and more credible when you give us credit in those instances when we do it right. Mr. Rutenberg, whom I respect greatly, I think that he's an excellent journalist and obviously somebody who has brings a wide range of experience to the job that he has now, overlooked that fact in the column that he wrote a couple of weeks ago, and that's what prompted me sending that letter. the truth is, I expressed that concern to him privately after reading his column, and he acknowledged that was a fair point and encouraged me to make it publicly. So I give him credit for a willingness to engage on that. I don't want to leave you with the impression that he agreed entirely with the point that I was making, but I think that he believed it to be a credible one, and that was anyway. That's the backstory on how the letter to the editor appeared.
I guess I'm saying, is the incident with Secretary Clinton over the weekend, is that maybe evidence of a political benefit to being more transparent?
I see. Well, look, I think that's hard to assess. Part of the argument that President Obama was making in 2008, when he was making the case for greater transparency in government, is that there were instances where the Bush administration had not been. And President Obama was very interested in making a forceful and clear case about the different approach to governing the country that he would pursue than his predecessor did. So I think from that standpoint, his ability to talk about transparency was an effective way for him to illustrate some of the differences with the Bush administration. But I think my point is that transparency in its own right is not something that a lot of voters are going to consider. And that's okay. There are lots of other things for them to consider that are entirely legitimate. For example, the economic plans that are put forward by the individual candidates, the competence that the candidates bring to the job, the values that the candidates bring to the job, the ability of the candidates to represent the United States on the international stage, the experience that the candidates bring to the job. Those are all entirely reasonable criteria for voters to consider. Not a lot of them are prioritizing this question of transparency. And I know this is something that all of you, both professionally and personally, believe is important. And that means that you play an important role in our democracy in holding whoever is in the Oval Office accountable to the American people and for being transparent with the American people. But again, I guess the point that I'm trying to make here, that's a little meandering, I acknowledge. I chalk that up to it's still like 3 a.m. in Laos right now. So, but the point that I'm trying to make here is there are a variety of ways to evaluate transparency. And again, I think this is a point that all of you make with some persuasive power on a regular basis, that it doesn't just apply to the every other year report that you get from the president's physician, for example. It also applies to access to the president when he's meeting with congressional leaders. It also applies to the records related to the individuals who visit the president at the White House. So it applies to tax returns, something that just about every presidential candidate in both parties has provided in the context of running for this office. It certainly applies to the financial disclosures that sitting presidents file. So there are a variety of ways to draw that assessment, and it's not just whether or not a candidate included the press corps in their motorcade on one movement. Okay? Yeah. Let's just do a couple more. Cheryl?
Thanks, Josh. Quick policy one.
Yeah.
Back on the CR, Senator Cruz is looking to add a rider.
Haven't heard his name in here in a while.
Looking to add a rider to the CR. I know that's rare. It would prohibit the Commerce Department from giving up some of its oversight on internet domain names, and I'm wondering if that would be a big problem for this White House.
Well, I think it may be a bigger problem for Republicans if Senator Cruz considers a maneuver like the one that he employed back in 2013. So again, I haven't seen the specific proposal from Senator Cruz, and knowing him, he's not particularly concerned with the details. But the fact of the matter is that there is a long-established transition that's scheduled to take place that would essentially transfer responsibility of establishing internet domain names outside of the hands of government and into the hands of a non-governmental organization. Now, I know what you're thinking. you might think that somebody who is an ardent champion of smaller government and getting the government out of the hands, or out of the business of the American people, would praise such an effort. So it might lead you to conclude that Senator Cruz is interested in something other than the merits of the specific proposal. But internet experts, scientists, business leaders, technology experts all agree that this is the most effective approach and the right thing for the long-term security and well-being of the internet. So that's the approach that we're intending to pursue. We'll see what kind of tricks Senator Cruz has up his sleeve. All right. Gregory, I'll give you the last one.
Has the president been examined by a physician for any reason since the last report we had in February?
Well, for any reason? I think that's...
I'm excluding meetings with physicians to talk about healthcare policy. And
Yeah.
Has he been examined by a physician?
Right. Look, I don't think that we're going to set a standard where we're going to read out every conversation the president has with its doctor. And I don't think that's...
The standard you articulated earlier in this briefing was that the American people have a right to know the health status of the person who occupies this office. Has there been any material change to his health? Any complaints, any ailments that we should know about?
Well, look, I mean, all of you have been in situations where you've seen him, coughing at a news conference or, having a cold. But no, I'm certainly not aware of any material change in the president's overall health. And I don't think the standard that people expect is that every time the president talks to his doctor that we're going to read out the conversation to all of you.
Fair enough, but apparently the standard is that we have to ask whether the,
No,
office has pneumonia before we find out.
I'm not suggesting that that's the standard. I think the standard is that you'd get a memo like this from the president's doctor that I think is pretty detailed in terms of listing his body mass index, his resting heart rate, his blood pressure, a whole bunch of other things that give you an indication of the health of the president of the United States. And I think it's fair to assume that if there were a significant change in any of this, that we would either tell you or you'd be able to tell. But I don't think we're going to set a standard where every time the president talks to his doctor that we're going to read out the conversation.
There's no material change in the president's health since that report in February.
Certainly not one that I'm aware of. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not prepared to play one on TV either. But no, I'm not aware of any material change to the president's health since the last update you received from his physician, which was just back in March, so not that long ago. All right. Thanks, everybody.